Okay, so hello everybody. Thank you for joining us for this meeting of the Boulder County Regional Opioid Council. It's August 30th, 2023, and we have a full agenda in front of us. So I think since we do all know one another here on the screen, we've been working together as the Regional Opioid Council for a while now. I don't think we need to take time with introductions, but we do have first 15 minutes that Kelly's going to take us through to just give us some important updates. So Kelly, do you want to go ahead?
Sure, thank you. So let me go ahead and share my screen. Oops. Make sure that shared correctly. All right, perfect. So as Commissioner Levy mentioned, welcome everyone to the August meeting of the Boulder County Opioid Regional Council. Just a quick recap of our agenda and our virtual meeting guidelines. So as a reminder, this is not a public hearing. We do have members of the public that are able to attend and partake in the dialogue. For members of the public, if you have any burning questions, thoughts, comments, please feel free to put them into the chat, but please know that the conversation and the dialogue will remain just among council members. So that will not be part of the record of the conversation today. So our agenda for today, I will start with some updates and then give a little bit of a progress recap for some of the work that our operations group, our advisory committee, has been doing throughout July and August. And then we're going to have some conversation around resetting the context. So I will outline some short and longer term planning goals and timelines that we have coming forward. And then we'll have some conversation about the council's approval of those approaches for the goal, approval of approaches for those plans, as well as how the council members see sort of their role in helping to shape some of these priority areas. And then we will close out with next steps. So first up, in terms of updates, there is one new face in our group today, Tucker Yearman. So welcome, Tucker. Folks in this space have heard me announce that we are getting a couple supportive roles to assist in all of the work that's trickling down from the abatement effort. And one was our opioid abatement project manager. So Tucker was sort of supporting some of this work early on. You might recognize him from being in our very preliminary conversations about the shovel-ready programs. And then Tucker joined the behavioral health roadmap team, so you might know him from that space as well. And we're really excited to have him dedicated back to supporting me and the operations group, as well as any work that comes out of our work with a facilitator in the future. So an update on that RFP for facilitation and evaluation. So we have a bit of a delay in getting an agency within that role. So a bit of a process hiccup, and we did need to go ahead and reopen the RFP. So again, this was for an agency that's going to assist us with some community convenings, some process facilitation and strategic planning, as well as some evaluation of our investments moving forward. So we're in the final stages of now selecting that agency and hoping that they can be on board by the September ROC meeting, if not by the October at the latest. Some updates at the state level, the Colorado Opioid Abatement Council. So you're going to hear me talk a lot about our submission plan deadline. So we were working off of an assumption of a September 15th deadline for our allocation amounts. However, we've been working with the state, and the state has been really flexible and put out an ask to all the regions to see if regions really would like to have another submission date after that September date. And we have voiced that we are in favor of adding another submission deadline that would be in November. So you're going to hear a lot of our plans today ping off of a November deadline for submission of our initial plan. And then just some reflections. The COAC did hold their annual conference the week of August 14th. And so just put it out to our operations group last week. There were 4 or 5 individuals on that group that were able to attend, and wanted to call forward what folks saw as some key themes in those discussions and in those presentations. So just wanted to share a few themes that came forward for folks. One was a big one around the makeup of different councils. So there were panels where different regional councils and respective advisory boards could sort of report on, you know, what their makeup was, what some of the pros and cons of particular ways of coming together or committees sort of converging. What were the pros and cons of those various makeups? So heard a lot about groups that were doing more of a joined committee between their regional council and their advisory group, but also just held space for a voting cohort within that larger group. So just a little bit of conversation on the pros and cons of those various styles of coming together. Other key themes that came out, peers, peer support specialists as a profession, certification of peers, all of that was a really big theme area. Recovery and recovery supports and the gaps around recovery supports. Prevention, marketing, public awareness building, how to plug into the state's marketing campaign was another huge sort of theme that came out for individuals. Workforce shortages all across the care continuum and the sort of problems that's driving, even as we try to make investments in particular areas, dealing with the fact that there's not necessarily individuals in certain regions to fulfill those roles. And then finally, a theme area that came out was a big focus on youth as a priority population. And then we also heard feedback that there was a really great emphasis on the involvement of law enforcement and a lot of work that law enforcement across the state has done to reduce stigma and to really engage in this opioid abatement work more completely. So finally, a current funding amount. We finally have this. We know that we are allocated $4.4 million next year. And so I know in our last discussion in May, we were still waiting for an absolute figure there. We did have some estimates of what to anticipate. However, this has really bumped up due to a recent settlement, which I believe we discussed in May from the CBS and Walgreens settlement. There was also some additional funding held over from last year. If you can recall, we drew down all of our funds. However, we did not allocate all of them. So in total, we have $4.4 million to spend to draw down in our next allocation. But important to note that this is going to be sort of a one-time bump up and that our averages moving forward will return to about 1.8 million per year. So just to kind of give a little bit more of a visual on that, again, next year we'll see sort of a bump up in funding up to that 4.4 million amount. And then those funds, the remainder of those funds will join all of our other funds, all of our other allocation dollars in that 18-year allocation arc. Together, all of our settlements currently show that we'll have, after next year's bump, a $1.8 million average to spend in each subsequent year. And of course, big caveat always, as settlements continue to land, these numbers can change. And I'll pause there and see if there's any questions on the allocation amounts. All right.
Kelly, just a quick question, and less on the amounts and not for here necessarily, but I assume at some point we'll get some update on some of the early, like what did that we approved in the previous allocation and to see where we are in those projects. So yeah,
absolutely. That's a great question. So one of the topics we're going to talk about later today is continuation funding and whether or not this council approves of looking at continuation funding as a short-term strategy. And so we're going to make some recommendations of if we do want to offer continuation funding to those programs, what might our process be? What questions should we ask about how they spent their dollars, outcomes, clients served, et cetera, so that we can make some informed decisions of whether or not we want to offer continuation funding to those programs. Okay. So let's can move this forward.
And Kelly, I'll just add the important role of the facilitator / evaluator in really grabbing that picture of what we've accomplished and how we're moving the mark going forward. So that will be a really great tool for the BC ROC as well.
Absolutely. So switching gears a little bit, I wanted to talk about some updates from our operations group. So we have, in that delay of getting an RFP agency on board to help with some of these initial strategic planning conversations, we decided to dive in ourselves, make the most use of our time and expertise between now and our plan submission to start kind of figuring out where do our priorities generally lie. So I wanted to give you a snapshot of some of our process in July and August. So really where we decided to start, and this was the primary conversation that we had in August, was looking across the entire list of approved programs and approved uses for investing these dollars. So we've talked about, the 5 approved purpose areas in this group, but I don't think we've ever gotten as granular as really highlighting how many different types of programs or interventions are approved for spending. So this is actually, it's an appendix to that memorandum of understanding, really the guiding document that the COAC put forward. And it's 5 full pages in the appendix. So you can start to see the numbers here within the categories. Each of those is how many different kinds of programs or interventions are approved for spending within that topical area. So for example, treatment, you have 13 different areas that you can use your spending in. I won't go through all of these, but suffice to say, it's a really broad list. So what we wanted to start with is really a process to distill this list down, to make it more manageable, to be able to sort of, look at the full list of approved uses and how we can spend our money, but also start to categorize things so we can have more of a dialogue that's actionable and that we can start to pull forward some priorities. And then another thing that we wanted to do in this exercise was really apply a crosswalk of evidence base. So you're going to hear me mention this particular piece of evidence base that we really have been leaning on, and we're going to frame out for the council here today as well, the John Hopkins Primer, which is really an evidence-based article on, what are the 9 core strategies that all regions or municipalities should have in mind as they start to invest these abatement dollars. And so to the extent that we could really pull some of the programs and tie them directly into any of those 9 strategies, we also highlighted that for the group as well. So a little bit more about the method to distill down that list, that 5 pages of all the different programs. So Tucker is our mastermind behind this effort. So if you have any questions, he is here to answer. But really there was 3 different processes of distilling this list down. So first pass, just looking for core tags, areas that are sort of common across the different programming or the description of programming. And then with 2 additional rounds of distillation, Tucker was able to call forward 16 theme areas. So these are sort of higher level kind of categories that all of the different programs fell within. So this gave us a more manageable way to sort of review all of the different relevant programs and start to weigh in on our priority areas. Still to come a little bit more on this distillation process, we have heard loud and clear both in this space as well as our operations group that we want to overlay this or do some sort of a crosswalk to what came forward in our behavioral health roadmap planning process. We know there was significant engagement of community members and folks with subject matter expertise to hear where are our gaps, what do we know we want to invest in. A lot came out of that space in terms of recovery, addiction supports, other things on the sort of care continuum that might be relevant for us to fold in here as we look for evidence of our own community and our local context where we know we need to invest. And then just a quick snapshot of the activity we had the operations group do with this distilled list. We first kicked off by reviewing the 9 Johns Hopkins best practices, which I'm going to review with this council next, just to set a framework. You know, these are, again, sort of the best practices of what regions need to have at a core to make sure that they're really addressing some of the root issues and really having effective abatement strategies. And then we reviewed the full list of those approved uses that Tucker distilled down for us. We went theme by theme. And really the exercise was to rank at the programming level high, medium, or low priorities within each of these thematic areas. And then we just had some good conversation about, you know, what is most important for us to achieve within this theme area. So treatment, for example, what is most important for us to achieve in this space? What are these rankings as we go through high, medium, low? What does it bring up for you? And then also, are there any similar programs that we can start to kind of package together as a singular priority? So, for example, some of our treatment programming might have called out a specific priority population like pregnant women. Is there any way we can package that with a broader strategy area that's pretty similar? So just those kinds of conversations. I will say this was a good process and a lot of good dialogue, but it wasn't super time effective. And so our work between now and September is to figure out a way to continue moving through these themes and to have a space where we can have, you know, that good sort of sweet spot between meaningful dialogue, but also driving consensus a little bit quicker so that we can get to some core decisions on priorities by the end of our September and into our October meetings. I'll pause before I move ahead there and see if there's any questions on that initial prioritization exercise from the operations group.
I'm sorry, copy me again. And maybe we'll learn a little bit more about it as you go into the next section, and perhaps further conversation down in the agenda. Mm-hmm. But wanting, I guess, sitting here, how do we get a little bit more depth into some of those conversations so that we can tie that a little bit more closely to the recommendations that will then come to us? And again, that's perhaps a different coming further down the line, but it brought it up as you were just recapping this. So I just want to put it out there.
Absolutely. No, I think it's a perfect reflection. And that's exactly what we're going to be asking council members today. We'll be going through, you know, some key decisions that we know are coming and some recommendations for how we approach those. But we also really want to hear how have we helped the council inform this decision? What could we do better? What is some of the tie-in with the operations group that you would like to see done differently? So absolutely great, great to bring forward because we'll be having that conversation for sure. Just a great cue up for transitioning into our next section. So really resetting our context. You know, we're entering sort of a different phase of work than we have been focusing on in the past. As you all know, our shovel-ready approach of last year, we've always said was something that was a little bit driven by a tight timeline, the need to stand up a lot of processes that didn't formerly exist, but also get some of these dollars out the door to really deserving programs. And always knew that we were going to be spending this initial or this subsequent funding cycle to be a little bit more strategic in how we fund our programs. So wanting to kind of shift and pivot our focus to that space. So as I mentioned a few times before, this is the Johns Hopkins document that we have been sort of relying on for some initial guidance. It's called the Primer on Spending Funds from Opioid Litigation, a guide for state and local decision makers. And again, it's really aimed at calling forward what are the core strategies that a region needs or core interventions that a region needs. What are basically the larger components that we want to make sure we have in place across our region. And so these 9 strategies, I'll just read them off. First is broaden access to naloxone, increase use of medications to treat opioid use disorder, provide treatment and supports during pregnancy and postpartum, expand services for neonatal opioid withdrawal syndrome, fund warm handoff programs and recovery services, improve treatment in jails and prisons, enrich prevention strategies, expand harm reduction programs, and support data collection and research. So again, this is really just sort of to ground us a little bit as we move into some of these conversations around strategy and approach, just to be thinking about, you know, what do we know we need at a minimum to move this work forward in a meaningful way. So some of our short and long-term funding decisions, I'm going to outline here, kind of talk about some timeline and some implications. The first that we're really trying to figure out right now is where to sort of park our dollars across the various investment categories that are within that cost system. So as a reminder, the cost system is the online system that the state hosts, and it's where we go in on these deadlines that I've mentioned a few times. It's where we go in and we allocate our dollars across a number of different categories. So the really important thing to note here is that we do not need to, at this point, have really program level allocation amounts figured out. There is the ability to draw down the dollars and assign them across the three larger categories in the cost system, which are prevention, treatment, and other uses. And then you can make some assignments to subcategories or programs within each of those three. However, there's relative flexibility to move all of your funds among the different programs within each of those three categories. And then if we did want to also make any adjustments of moving funding from one category to another, we can do that by our March amendment period. So just wanted to kind of frame that out in terms of what we're really, needing to submit in the next couple months here is really where do we want to park those dollars for now? What's our general allocation priority across those three areas and their more basic approved uses within. And then the next sort of conversation and tackle, what's our short-term plan? Again, something that we're trying to pull forward by that November date versus our process for a longer-term plan, and how do they weave together? And you'll hear us recommend a little bit more around that, but really the reason I put March of 2024 there is, obviously long-term planning will be ongoing, but we're really looking to that amendment period that comes up in March of 2024 as our next major milestone to revisit everything that we've learned about our long-term plan up to that date and say, hey, do we want to move any funding across, the allocation buckets that we chose? Do we want to go in and start to allocate at that programming level? Are we there? And so that's a big milestone in terms of our longer term planning. Some of those questions under there around continuation funding and what's our process around that? How do we fuse in additional programs? That'll be a little bit of the focus of our recommendation today. And then finally, what's our term for long-term or broader investment? Again, you'll see that March 2024 is sort of indicated as like a deadline there, but really that's the main milestone whereby we'll have the opportunity to amend anything that we put forward in the short term by November, but we learn a little bit more between November and March about what our needs are, and we can amend accordingly. So with that in mind, some recommended short-term strategy approaches. One of our nearest term sort of decisions that we've been kind of mulling over is this continuation funding. How do we sustain currently funded programs while making space for new investments? And do we want to sustain all programs? If so, what are the questions we're asking to see if they've effectively spent their first year of dollars? And what they plan to do with their subsequent years of dollars. So our recommended short-term plan in this space is really to review all of our funded programs from last year. And from the start, we can eliminate a few that we're actually only asking for one-time funds. So there's a small handful that we're just looking for one-time seed dollars or a one-time investment, and we're not seeking sustainability moving forward. So those can immediately be removed from the list. Then we would look at the remaining current programs and we would do some investigation with each of the programs to ask, how has your money been spent? we can easily pull up what the spend down looks like from our fiscal department and say, well, this program has spent all of their dollars already, but this program hasn't spent a cent. And what's the story between that? And what does that mean in terms of our criteria for programs to move forward? Are we looking at spend down as a primary criteria? So digging into that sort of expense area and seeing what they're doing with their current dollars. Then, and we've started this conversation already with the operations group, we would develop a set of questions for each of the funded programs that really pulls forward a little bit more about the outcomes. So one of the questions we posed to our operations group in July was, if you had an opportunity to interview all of these 25 funded programs, what would you want to know? What questions would you ask these programs about how they use the dollars, on what, how they would use new dollars, the outcomes they're seeing, et cetera. And so those sorts of questions are still being developed with the input of our operations group. And then we would package that into a recommended set of programs to offer continuation funding. Additionally, and sort of throughout this process, we'd like to continue discussion both in this council and the operations group on any other key sort of more timely priorities that we specifically want to fund right now. So anything that we think we want to specifically call out outside of the continuation funding element. We'll have time to talk about feedback on this and the long-term strategy, but I will pause and just see if there's any initial questions.
Just to say, Kelly, I would be really interested in seeing the set of questions that is eventually created to ask for each of the funded programs.
Okay, absolutely. And I'd be happy to share our minutes from July, which has at least an initial capture of some of that conversation and what the ops groups sort of put out there as things that they would want to know.
I think, Kelly, I would like to offer that for the ROC, this is going to be an ongoing conversation and tension point, right? Because the annual funding, with the exception of the blip for next year, is not a lot of money. And many of the programs that we funded for the first funding tranche were programs that did not have their own source of sustainable funding, right? So it's easy to think, well, this is sustainable funding because it's over 18 years, but each year it's a small amount of funding. And there may be some bigger transformational work that the ROC is really interested in doing. And how do we do that without putting our ongoing programs at risk? And I know the board has talked, the council has talked previously about moving programs into a local source of funding, like a city budget, for instance. And so I think we're just going to have to recognize that that's going to be an ongoing conversation for this board, and it may be a challenging one. So I think this is why we wanted to raise this question now. I think the other reality that Kelly mentioned is that we had hoped that we would be in a more strategic conversation at this point with our facilitator evaluator, but since that got pushed down the pike a little bit, we thought, well, is there an interim space to continue funding while we're figuring out what that more strategic approach looks like, and then use that additional one-time funds to maybe accomplish something more strategic.
And just for clarification, Robin, is the state's expectation that we're going to push out that 4.4 million all next year?
No, we can certainly carry it over and use it whenever we want. Is that right, Kelly?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that is a core element of how we kind of approach these things strategically, knowing that that is just going to be that one-time bump and then the dollars will kind of go back down. But because we don't have that limitation or restriction on how long we need to spend some of those dollars, if we draw them all down in 1 year, we can begin to allocate them and start to strategically plan about how we want to maybe invest in some multiple year programs or other investments that might span those dollars across a longer time arc.
Yeah, if I could add just one thing to Robin's comment that was helpful for me to reflect on at the conference. I think there's a tendency for communities to look at these dollars internally, is to say, well, here's a pot of money. How do we spend it? And then how do we sustain those efforts? And I think what people were coming to the realization around is, well, it really needs to be tied to other sources of funding, that in and of itself, these funds are probably not sufficient to do long-term investment on their own. So at some point, we also need to think about how we bridge these resources with other resources or other strategies we see playing out in the county that we want to invest in, so that we're not solely relying on these funds for the support of programs that are designed to address opioids and other substance use disorders.
I just want to say, Jim, I really appreciate that and love the notion of, and I don't know that it is us, I think the ops team that has that expertise, like how do we look and scan and do a sort of a mapping of what other strategies and initiatives and programs exist so that we can then braid these funds into them, and would love to have then that come to the board as that moves forward. But I think the leveraging and the stacking of funds is going to be critical as we move forward. And don't think, and I could be wrong here, but don't think yet we're at that point that we have done that kind of exercise.
Not quite, yeah.
Which is why I think the question of do we continue with what we have right now as an immediate question before us versus trying to dive in and trying to create new things is probably where you're trying to take us, Robin and Kelly. Is that fair?
I think that's a fair articulation of the question for the board to consider, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, sorry. Dr.
Well, and you know, certainly the board may have other thoughts and ideas about how to manage this bridge. And we're really open to your direction and knowledge and thoughts. And I love, Nerea, what you said about how are these programs connected with other programs that are funded, and how do we leverage that? So that's, and I know that we've brought that up, and you know, Susan, I think you have spoken to that pretty consistently at other meetings. So keeping that in mind is really important.
And just for clarity, Robin, are you inviting that conversation now, or are you holding that off for another moment in this meeting?
Kelly, I think there was another piece we wanted to get to, or should we just pivot?
It doesn't really matter to me. There was going to be one more long-term recommendation, and then we were going to kind of talk about both of them together, but I'm happy to adjust. We have plenty of time, so.
Yeah, thanks for that reminder. I think it would be great to sort of have the long-term strategy out there, so that as we're talking short-term, we're keeping the long-term in the back of our mind, or it will inform the discussion if that works for everyone.
Great. Okay, so, and of course the longer term strategy, because it's still in development, these are a little bit more broad than the last slide, a little bit more specific, but our recommended sort of long-term strategy is to utilize the flexibility in the cost system to draw down our funds, but also to leave some of them unallocated so that we're able to sort of figure out our longer term funding strategy and then allocate those dollars during the amendment period. Weaving together our short and long-term plans. So a lot of this work is what we're hoping to lean into with the contractor. You've heard me mention a lot the November date in terms of all of the things we're trying to accomplish in the short term, and then the March amendment period being really our sort of relief valve if we need to make some adjustments. So we have that time between those two. Well, really, we have the time between now and March, realistically, to really start doing the longer term planning and to use that March amendment period to adjust anything accordingly. And then also utilizing this time to do a lot more of the internal pieces that were admittedly a little bit difficult and timely in our first year of allocation. So making sure that we're adjusting the dollars to really look at the priorities and the funding areas and what makes sense to fund particular priorities. Is it a direct funding approach? Is it an RFP or another competitive bid process? This group has talked about, you know, for different funding areas or different priorities, it's probably a bit of a both and. So as we develop those longer term priority areas, being able to then marry that with our internal process steps to say what's most appropriate for a competitive bid process, what's most appropriate for a more directed funding process. And then also separately but ongoing, exploring with this group any other potential priorities, areas that might be bigger ticket, that really span all of the municipalities and really require some additional maybe research or evidence to support the council's understanding of how we really plug them into our broader set of priority areas. And so last, I just want to kind of put this up in a visual format because I know everything I just babbled was a whole lot of words. And so just thought this might be more helpful to take a look at. Really everything that I mentioned being our emphasis in the short term, you can see coming due in that November plan submission period. So really figuring out this process for continuation funding, which programs are we funding, why, how, what's our criteria, what questions are we looking into. Also looking to see if we do have any additional agreed upon priorities that we really want to move forward now. And then also the general allocation across the approved use areas within the cost system. So treatment, prevention, other, and then a couple of subcategories of approved use within, but again, does not go as low as programming. And then the long-term plan being woven in as well, starting, you know, kind of in that overlap period of October, November, really having the much longer term guided process, identifying gaps, needs, priorities, and the key investments that we want to make with these dollars. And then you can see the amendment period coming up in March. So anything that comes from that longer term planning process, being able to sort of adjust accordingly in March. And then also wanted to indicate where we anticipate plugging in our agency that's going to assist with a lot of this planning work, really aiming for the end of September, if not early October, to get that work moving with an agency.
Kelly, can I just add a little, just try to boil this down for folks, because it's pretty confusing in terms of the way these dollars are flowing. So I just, people may totally get this, but I'll maybe try to simplify so that there is an understanding of how the dollars work. And so we started with one set of settlements. The money came down, and then we had to figure out where to allocate that relative to those cost categories. And most of that we spent, but there's some still sitting kind of in our bank account. With this new $4 million coming down, what we want to be able to do is figure out whether or not we can draw it into these different cost categories so that we have those dollars available. In other words, the money kind of sits in a bank account that we can't access until we say we want to allocate it across these different categories. Now, the categories don't need to then reflect where we actually spend the money. It's just categories like treatment or peer services or recovery. So what we want to do, I think, in this middle phase is to figure out where we can bring those dollars, generally speaking, into these different categories so that once we do make decisions strategically about where we want to spend them, the money's available to us. Because if we don't bring it down into those categories, the money is sitting up at a level that we can't access them. So that's why Kelly is pointing out this September/November timeline to try to bring the dollars down into categories. And then we do some planning and figure out, well, here's how we want to spend those dollars. We can put that over as long a time horizon as we want in terms of spending. And then in March, if we got the allocation for those categories a little bit, wrong, like we put too much in the treatment bucket and not enough in the recovery bucket, March is our opportunity to adjust those dollars so that we can then take that forward and spend them in the ways that we want to. So it's kind of a learning process that we're going to use to help us make the best decisions. But the bottom line is if we don't have money in the categories, we can't really access it. So I don't know if that's helpful for folks, but I know for me, it's a little bit mystifying how it all works.
And Jim, going forward, that will be an annual process.
Correct.
That's saying we want to draw down the funds, put them in these buckets, and then there'll be a period of time where we can make changes.
Yep.
And so just for the board to remember that we will always be circling back to that task.
Yep. And so long as the money is in those categories, we can spend it whenever we want to. There is no limitation or expectation that we have to spend some money sooner than later. So it gives us a lot of real flexibility. The only thing that we're really needing to figure out is generally where do we want the emphasis in the dollars at a certain point in time so that it will support our decisions around how to do RFPs or direct funding to certain organizations or identify and invest in certain priorities.
And so we did have a number of kind of key questions for the group to go over. I'll hand it off to Robin to sort of facilitate us through this portion of the conversation. Oh, Robin, you mean?
Sorry about that. Back to Nuri's question is we would like to wrestle a little bit around this continuation funding. And whether that's, we just do that short term, or do we want to wrestle with how does continuation funding get managed as a sustainability plan while we're also trying to pay attention to emerging issues in the community, or there may be emerging best practices or new treatment options that don't currently exist. So what does that look like? Or do we not fully answer that question and say, well, we'll address that question annually based on the funding, based on the current environment? But there could be multiple factors that would inform that. Do we, with this conversation about short term, do we say we're going to prioritize certain areas and take advantage of things that we know now? So one example is the state is going to be doing a statewide marketing and public awareness building, which we have recognized as important. And I believe we funded a couple projects in that arena around supporting prevention efforts and public awareness. But it might be that there is a local role that is connected to the statewide approach that would require dedicated funding. And then lastly, you've sort of seen the timeline and how we think we do need the time to have these strategic conversations. And so if we gain some progress today on the short-term approach, do you all agree that then we move more to that longer-term strategic process? So I guess we'll we'll start with the concept of continuation funding. And I know that has been up front of mind for many of our ops members who are managing programs that don't have sustainable funding. So just want to open that question to folks and see what you're thinking.
Robin, I don't know if you can see that Nuria's hand was up.
Oh, sorry.
It was, but I realized I've been talking and asking questions a lot, so I'm happy to take a back seat and come back to me.
I don't see any other hands, Nuria, so I welcome.
Oh, I see Susan.
Oh,
Susan,
okay.
I think
My hand was up and somehow it went down, but I'm happy to defer.
Yeah, I think this makes sense. I mean, if there's things we're currently doing that we don't have funding for and that have good outcomes, and we want to continue to support them, I support that. I mean, I think part of my question was just making sure that we're clear about what the outcomes are for current programs before we make a decision on continuing funding. But that makes sense to me. And yeah, I really support a little bit more time for some of that longer term planning as well.
Claire, do you want to go next?
Yeah, I'm happy to. Yeah, somebody made the observation already that there's really not that much money available. You know, in lump sum, it's a lot, but if we're required to spread it out over 18 years, it's not. And there's this temptation, of course, to want to really think big and do transformative things, and that may not really be possible with these particular dollars. And it's an opportunity, it seems to me, to test out some things that we may then want to be able to get funding from another source for. So, you know, just in thinking about the initial investments that we made, you know, I think that was the right thing to do, given, you know, that we needed to get some money out the door and start working on this. But I'm thinking I wouldn't be too quick to change approaches here. And I mean, in other words, I guess I would support generally continuation funding so that some of these things have an opportunity to show results. A year may not be enough. It takes time to program money. So I would, in general, support continuation while we really think about, you know, what it's actually possible to do with $1.8 million a year. And you know, looking at the Johns Hopkins guidance document on core strategies, those are fantastic, but we're not getting enough money for that. And so I'm just favoring maybe, you know, going narrow and deep rather than broad and shallow. And you know, in this context, continuing with what we're doing, I think makes a lot of sense, so that we really can get some history and practice with those programs.
Thank you, Claire. Nuria?
Yeah, I think similarly in terms of continuing. First of all, I really like the short and long-term strategies. I think you're being really thoughtful, and the approach of sort of the next steps, particularly in the short term, I really appreciated and would like to figure out or hear more, maybe not at this meeting, but at a future meeting. How does that deep dive about the strategies come back to this council, right? Because I think there's a whole lot of great conversation happening at the ops team, which is frankly where it needs to go. I don't always feel in the best position on this council body to have heard that in advance, so that then I'm coming to this to these decisions with as much information armed to give you as much support and to champion what's been going on, because that's really what I also feel like is part of the role is to champion the effort. So that can be a different kind of conversations. But in general, I love the framing of the short and long-term strategic plan, if you will. And in terms of continuous funding, I think I land a bit similar to Claire. Like, I think we had to do some things last year. I'm okay because I don't think we've gotten out the door yet to see what the result of those have been. So I don't want to create, my only concern is I don't want to create legacy programs that then we're trapped to doing, and we do what we're often accused of as government, right? Like we're funding the same things and not seeing different results. I think it's too soon to have the conversation of stopping what we funded last year, but we have to build in, I think, some evaluation. And I know the team is thinking about that, because not all strategies work the same way and they may not be worthwhile. And to Claire's point, we're not going to have unlimited funds. So I think it behooves us to constantly be looking at those programs that we have said yes to see if that is the best and highest use of those dollars. Because right now I think it's right that we're targeted and narrow, but at some point as we pick up speed and have learned more, then we may have bigger opportunities to be more transformative. And I don't think we're there yet. Right. So I think I'm okay, at least from my perspective, to continue what we've set in motion, but would not want those to be in perpetuity without a chance to reevaluate and see if we are on the right track.
That's great. And just so I'm landing on one piece of what you said is we do have further down in the agenda to talk about the relationship with ops group and how can there be better connection so that you, and I appreciate your word of championing. Mm-hmm. So just want to put a pin in that. Lexi, I think your hand is next.
I was just wanted to concur with other folks. I think this makes sense. I do think it is, I mean, just to follow up a little more, I think it's a little tricky to look for outcomes yet because a lot of projects really didn't get their funding in place for several months after January. And so we're looking at maybe 6 months and maybe even further delays if projects needed to do extra work between getting the award and actually being able to roll. So I do think that there's a little bit of trickiness about being able to just asking the right questions to get a sense of whether funded initiatives are on track and if they're going in the right direction and if they're not finding barriers that are going to be significant, but that they're on a path for success. And I appreciated that Nuria's questions about, you know, how do we make sure that we're in a position to be able to intentionally reflect on and support what's coming out of the ops team or be able to make comments on it in a way that's productive for everybody.
Thank you, Lexi. Susan, I see your hand.
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate what everyone said. And just to circle back around to the comments and wanted to add to what Lexi just said or echo that, I think around, for me, I understand that after a year, it's going to be hard to see outcomes for some of these programs. I just would want to make sure that there is a check-in with all of the programs, to Lexi's point, from a process perspective, to say, are there barriers to referrals? What are you seeing? What are you not seeing? So that we can get some initial indication of what the progress is or lack thereof, and if there's anything we can do to help support that. So I just wanted to clarify my statement before.
So I'm hearing general consensus about supporting the current strategy of who we funded, as long as that includes a check-in and provide you with the questions that people are being asked, and respecting that, yeah, we don't have a year under our belt yet. And so wanting to give programs fair amount of time. And I think that this board is, I think we can also recognize that there may be things that pop up in the meantime that we have to think about, whether it's an emerging community issue. You know, one thing we really haven't talked about is how do we manage community interest and community questions about funding availability. We've seen a little bit of that trickle in with the state innovation grants, and you know, again, wonder about the role of the council with the state's process, and we've talked to the state about that as well. So, but I'm hearing a interest in the path going forward, and then as these other things pop up, we can bring them to the ROC meetings for discussion as needed, if that makes sense. And sounds like even though we understand the short turnaround in terms of what's been funded and then continuing those grants, there's a recognition that we start the strategic conversation sort of in a parallel process, and that there's appetite to do that work. Am I hearing that correctly?
Yeah, and I love the idea of making sure that this work is kind of aligned with the behavioral health roadmap. I think that makes an awful lot of sense.
Yeah, and that goes back to the point of let's make sure everything is, you know, somehow knitted together, and so that we're taking advantage of other funding resources, and making adjustments along the way. You know, Kelly mentioned the ops group talking about, I think it was the ops group, or maybe it was part of the cost plan around, you know, do we, you know, take 2 or 3 areas and put them in a category that makes more sense, so that we're actually tracking it in a blended and braided manner purposefully, not just accidentally. Anything more about this that people would like to weigh in on or add to before we move on?
I raised my hand, but if my comment may actually be for later in your discussion questions. It's just, the comment was, just so I get it out, or the thought about, you know, as you brought up the roadmap, sort of thinking about what, with the parameters we have for these funds, the process, timeline, et cetera, you know, everything that comes along with them. And of all the things that we'd like to use them for, and the goals that and the allowable uses, what are these like most well suited to be used for versus some other source of money we may be able to get? You know, going back again to the really limited amount of funds and all of the, you know, the areas that we may want to invest in. And is there a way to look at these and say that these particular funds are just best suited for this purpose? Without having everything in front of me, I can't say what it is. I don't know. I mean, I really don't know. You know, they're time limited, but 18 years is a long time in the world of publicly funded programs. So that wouldn't be it. That, you know, money is money, and to some extent it's fungible. But I just don't know whether that kind of a lens might be important to keep in mind.
I think it's really important, Claire. I think we want to be protective of these funds and that we don't dilute them across the broader need, recognizing sometimes it's really hard to delink the specific reason we got these settlement funds from opioid and other substance use from behavioral health issues, right? Sometimes those are just so connected. But I think it's a really important point. And that we need to keep front of mind. Alexia, I see your hand up.
Yeah, I just have one more quick.
Over-the-counter drugs such as.
Oh, sorry, Alexis is talking to me because I called out Lexi.
I haven't heard that problem before. Thanks. I just wanted to pick up on something that Claire said that I thought was really interesting and maybe lift it up just a second for a conversation, which is pointing out that this is not enough money to be transformational in a kind of a big sense. And I'm curious if the group wants to think about whether there is appetite for kind of an innovation fund where we might, you know, try different ideas that could be incredible proof of concepts or could be complete failures. It's a question because sometimes when we get so locked into feeling like our funds are so precious and we feel like, you know, they're scarce, which, you know, a lot of ways they are, we become risk averse in a way that actually kind of could work against us. So I just wanted to kind of put that out there. It's not anything we have to think about today, but sometimes there are some amazing interventions that are low cost that make enormous impact. And it could be a really interesting space for, you know, Boulder County to be in that kind of innovation space. So just throwing it out.
Kelly, do you know, does the state plan on doing their annual innovation grants and infrastructure grants? Do they have have they pooled money and put it over there for an annual grant opportunity?
Yeah, they do. So if you can remember way back when we reviewed kind of the allocation percentages of where the dollars went, the state did in the MOU have like a 10% set aside that they were going to hold for ongoing grant opportunities. So we do know that the innovation grant will have another funding cycle. I would have to look back and see how many funding cycles the innovation grant is going to go on. I think at the time, and Tucker is probably going to chime in and correct me here, I think at the time it was 1 or 2 years, potentially 3 that they had innovation grant funding laid out. But Tucker, do you know?
At least at the conference, they didn't indicate an ending for the infrastructure. So they were saying that it was going to be twice a year, $2.5 million every cycle. And then this year they also did an innovation grant that was $4 million. They were pretty hush-hush at the conference about if they were going to continue doing that. But they did indicate that what they were really looking for from the state was for kind of cross-region collaboration, and that any type of collaboration that we can do with other regions would really elevate us to be able to access some of the infrastructure and innovation funding.
So Lexi, that might be a way of getting at what you're saying. I think the struggle is the timing of that.
Yeah, and just to be clear, I was really thinking in my head more about kind of small amounts of money to try innovative community projects that, you know, I mean, the state grants, you got to have a lot of infrastructure behind you. You got to have a lot of support. They take a lot of time. They're heavy. They're architectural, even though they're still called innovation grants. And I guess my brain was going to a place where it's like, how do we test like really grassroots community interventions that could be really interesting? Got it.
Thanks. Thanks for that clarification.
If I can add on to that, one of the things that I noticed from the conference as well was Larimer County seemed to take kind of that approach and really trying to use their funds as ways to kickstart new programs and then fade themselves out. So they seemed like they did kind of 4-year funding, where each year the amount of funding that they provided to programs dropped by 25% to the point where the programs that they were supporting or are supporting have weaned off of the opioid funds and either have identified other sustainable funds or, you know, they kind of go through that process of, was this transformational idea worth continuing? But they did kind of this wean off type plan.
And do we know the result of that? Did they get innovative requests?
question. I don't know that right off the top of my head, but can do some digging if the board would like.
They did. They were in the process of reviewing those, so that's why they didn't announce them at the conference. So they had announced the infrastructure grants. And I think if we take that as a lesson, if we want to go after either of those, most likely they're going to be funded to joint applications between regions. And as Tucker was saying, so I think we have opportunities to do that because there are other communities that are interested in looking at some cross-region options. So that would be, I think, a really good topic for this group to take on to look at whether or not we want to submit an application for one of those grant programs.
So Jim, I was hearing that from Tucker that Larimer County took their allocated funds and did that approach that Lexi suggested, not that they went after an innovation grant. So you know, just saying, hey, we're gonna fund for 4 years, small amounts of funding for new things to pilot or experiment with. And so I think there's a both and there.
One thing that, and just to throw this into the mix, one thing that might be interesting in hearing from a representative from Larimer is what are the questions that they're asking. As those years progress, it seems like they must have a plan in mind for how are we measuring success of certain programs so that when they come to the end of that 4-year arc, they can have some of those conversations of are we sustaining, are we not, et cetera. I don't know if it's maybe too early for them to have some of those questions in mind, but it might be worth connecting with them. It could help inform our own conversation about continuation funding.
Yeah, I think it's a great opportunity to connect with other regions, to find out what's working and to learn from one another. And I don't know if that's something that just happens at the annual conferences, or the ROC could decide to invite a meeting with another region and to hear what's happening.
I like that, Robin, and my only if it's a question of preference, I would say I'd love it if the ROC at some point invited that meeting, because being like, I don't know what the timing of those conferences are. And so if there's something we can learn sooner rather than waiting for a timing that we don't have control over. But love the notion of learning from others and seeing what's been working and frankly why, because sometimes the conditions for success are not the same everywhere else. And frankly, the conditions for failure also may not be the same in one place and may be successful elsewhere. So
yeah. Susan, you had your hand up, but then you put it down. Is there more input?
I was just thinking about a community of practice, and you know, it sounds like the conferences are spaced out, but you know, is there anything where all of the counties can form a community of practice to start talking about what they're seeing that's working well, exchanging information about, I think, to maybe Kelly's point of asking questions and learning from each other, how are people evaluating what's rising to the top is looking like something we may want to evaluate as a best practice, things like that. So I think it's tricky to do that only occasionally, or if you're only meeting once a year. You know, for us internally, I think having something like that for other topics monthly has been really helpful, and I just would be curious if there was an opportunity to do that. Or is that something that's been talked about?
No, I think that we're moving into you know, sort of a strategic conversation right now, and that this is what we want to capture and hear from you. So that's very helpful. And staff can explore what's, you know, I think everybody's in that sort of just gearing up mode. And so what other regions or councils have capacity to engage, let alone the work they're doing for their own region, right? That's we can explore that for sure. Any other reflections or thoughts or comments or questions before we move on? Okay, Kelly, do you want to advance the slide and remind me what's next?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've kind of touched on some of this already, but really kind of wanted to segue the conversation about continuation funding and the whole short-term, long-term planning concept into a broader conversation on the role of the council and just, you know, how we can best involve you in these conversations. We've already kind of gleaned some of that feedback just in the course of our conversation, but just some pointed questions on your role in strategic planning moving forward. I'll pass it back to you, Robin, to facilitate that.
Sure, and we had this conversation, I think, in May. And I think the reason to bring it back was we want to sort of embed a check on how this is going. Maybe not at every meeting, but again, we wanted to create that feedback loop to make sure that we're hitting the mark in terms of what you expected for this work and how you'd like to engage with this work. So I don't know if people have any comments based on what's happened so far today, as we have 15 minutes left. And I think we have a couple of other agenda items. But just to let you know that we do want to hear from you in a fluid way as we're forming this together. And so didn't know if anyone had any immediate thoughts that they wanted to share now, and then recognize we'll just be making space for this reflection ongoing. Nerea, yay, you got your hand up.
I know, I'm trying to be better. And I just wanted to say that I know you got other items, so I don't want to belabor this point, but wondering if we have some thoughts would be helpful to you to get those in advance of maybe our next meeting, and should we just send you some thoughts or questions or?
Yeah, that would be great.
Yeah.
That would be great.
Great.
And not to interrupt, I just want to chime in. This is actually our last agenda item. So we do have time right now if outside of next steps. And I don't know, I don't think we need a ton of time for next steps. So just putting that out there, we have time for conversation if you have ideas now.
So Kelly, maybe it would be useful to go back to that question about the ops group and engaging with the ops group per Nerea's comment earlier. So as you know, the ops groups meets monthly as well, right, Kelly?
Yeah.
And they meet before this meeting. You know, in other groups that some of us are involved in, sometimes we schedule a meeting that's purposely a combined meeting of ops members and the board. You know, other ideas may be we have an ops liaison person who attends the meetings for that dialogue. And I'm sure there are other ideas. So welcome diving into this one question before we go to next steps, if people have any immediate thoughts or interests in this area. Lexi.
I think this probably ties a little bit into Nurea's question too. And I won't speak for everyone, but I'm happy to do homework in between our meetings. If there are things coming out of the ops group that you'd like us to look at before our meeting, I don't know if the timing works, just an idea, but just so that, you know, we have a chance to have conversations that aren't quite so, you know, cold call conversations.
Yeah, and Kelly, I'm assuming that the ops board's meeting have minutes that we could send out ahead of time to the board members as well, that might foster that thinking as well.
Absolutely. We're typically, our cadence right now is that we're meeting at the end of every month. It's the last Thursday of every month. So typically it's about a week prior to the ROC meetings, or excuse me, a couple days prior to the ROC meetings. So we do have that turnaround time.
Claire, I see your chat about having additional materials in between meetings, and we can absolutely make that happen. Would it be helpful to get the PowerPoint in advance?
That would be helpful, and I'm not speaking, I don't want staff doing additional preparation, and it would just be, if there are other documents that you might be referring to, for instance, the Johns Hopkins materials, just links to existing resources, nothing new.
Great. Nuria, I see your hand up.
I'm trying to give some space for others, Robin.
No, you're helping us.
I just wanted to echo that. Like, I don't want extra, I certainly don't want to put any extra burden on staff, but I bet that they're working with materials that exist and happy to sign up for that extra homework, as Lexi said as well. And so echo the Claire and Lexi suggestions about that. And then frankly, I wouldn't mind if periodically, I don't think it's every meeting, but if at some point we have a joint meeting, I think that would be really interesting, just to get to know a little bit about the operations group and to see what they've been up to. I don't think we do a regular cadence, because I do think that would add too much work on their plan, and we could be bottlenecking some of the great work they're trying to move forward, and wouldn't want to suggest that. But if there are opportunities to have either a group, or maybe it's a liaison, that we get to know a little bit the operations team a little bit more, and you all in the county get to know them really well. For some of us, we don't see them as often, so it would be great, because that is what the expertise we want to lift up and champion a lot of times, and it would be great to hear directly. So
great.
And I'll just echo, I know I sort of fumbled on this a little bit, explaining this in the updates, but this was a primary conversation at the conferences. All regions have sort of a slightly different makeup of how they're bringing these conversations together through various committees, coalitions. Some do have a joint group that's both their council as well as their advisory, members, but it's just the council that votes. And so I'm not at all suggesting that we need to sort of blow up our structure and redo everything, but I do think there's space for us to get creative and learn about the ways that other regions have fused in both the sort of votes of leadership as well as the subject matter expertise of folks a little bit more close to the interventions. So something that we could look at is those experiences.
Okay. Not seeing any other hands up. So in terms of next steps, so the COAC Learning Collaborative meeting, Kelly, do you want to describe more about that?
Sure. So this is the group that comes together monthly. It's representatives from all of the different regions as well as the COAC staff. So it's led by Jamie Feld and Jack Patterson. And really, it's open to anyone who wants to attend. It's primarily all the regions coming together, a little bit around kind of community of practice focused questions, Susan, to your point. but they're a little bit more geared towards also like submission logistics, deadlines, major barriers that regions are running into, fiscal and accounting leads sometimes. But I'm always happy to share. They share the agendas in advance, and sometimes the content that they're speaking to is a little bit more broad in its application, and might be relevant for some of the council members if they want to get a little bit more perspective of what's going on in other regions. So again, as Robin mentioned, the next one is on the 7th, and we have not yet received an agenda, but we know that their focus is on regional funding requests and next steps. So we anticipate that we'll be hearing more about some of the stuff we introduced today, like the cost system and how far down we need to allocate within a possible other deadline in November. So some of those are likely on the docket for discussion on the 7th.
And do those happen the first Thursday of every month? Are they regularly scheduled?
Yes, they do. I'm trying to remember if I have the whole series that I can send to the group. I think I do. So yeah, I can share it all.
Sounds like they're more operational, Kelly, but just in case there's an agenda item that might be interesting to the board, just to have that on their calendars ahead of time might be helpful.
And Kelly, that's great that there's already a structure there. So it sounds like that could be something that morphs into more of a community practice once some of the funding questions are answered and that's taken care of, there could be a suggestion to keep that ongoing, to focus more on services and supports and evaluations and comparing notes around those kind of things. Do you see that as a potential?
Yeah, I absolutely agree. So actually, as you were mentioning that, this is the group that kind of came to mind. As I said, right now, it's a bit of a hodgepodge in terms of what's all discussed in that space. So it could be anything from, the cost system and funding timelines down to these are the fiscal processes we need you all to follow to make sure that the funds are allocated properly, and reporting and all of those things. So it can kind of, right now, it's still kind of going between high level and pretty operational in the weeds. But I do see the opportunity to kind of pull together some of potentially a smaller cohort of that same group that's a little bit more focused on some of those items that you brought forward, Susan.
Nuria?
I'm on a roll today, it seems, Rob. But great conversation, and it, I am one to, I'm a geek and want to read. If there are things that are high level to your whole high level and in the weeds, I want to just, at least from my on my end, if there are things that you all or the ops team would like us to do, right, in better support, then I'm open and willing to hear that as well. And for me, sometimes like those, creating maybe not creating a library because I don't want to add more, but if there are articles, if there is something coming out of that collaborative meeting that would be great background reading for us, or you think would be useful, then I'd be open and welcome that coming our way, because since this is not the space I am in, and some of the people in this room are, learning and having like a bigger, broader picture would be helpful to bring into the meetings in addition to all the sort of detail work that is planning. So just know that I'm receptive too if there are things that the ops team would like us to do to support them better.
That's great. And I think we can definitely, Kelly, love to think about that with you and Tucker about how to sort of make sure we're doing that in a regular way. I know that we share articles between each other, and if ROC members are less interested in that, that's fine, but just it's available. And we've heard from several of you that would be of interest today. So as Kelly mentioned, hopefully we'll have our facilitator evaluator on board for our next meeting, and we'll give you a heads up if that's happening. The other takeaways that I heard are, again, getting materials ahead of time to you, including the PowerPoint, articles to read, and I really appreciate hearing that, just sort of increasing your level of awareness and engagement, and that will really align nicely with our strategic conversation formation work that's going to evolve as well. So I really appreciate that. Kelly, the review of the existing grants for continuation possibilities, is that something that you'll have a review by our September meeting, or what's the timing of that, and what follow-up do we want to do with the ROC about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So what can you remind me, Robin, when the September meeting is of this council?
I think it's the 28th again. I think it's the end of the month.
Oh, okay. So that's actually the same day as the operations group. So
let me look that up, Kelly, before I commit to it.
So I'm just thinking there might need to be some advanced kind of homework that involves potentially the ROC and the operations group, maybe facilitating some conversation about what questions we want to see, just in case the cadence of the meetings is that the ROC actually meets before the next operations group. I know the operations group meets on the 28th, so it's possible that our cadence might be a little bit off in September, and we might have to adjust how we facilitate these questions or development of these questions. So let me give that a little bit more thought and just look at when the two meetings kind of align.
Yeah, I'm not finding it immediately, okay. So that would be great.
Okay.
All right, anything else for the good of the group or the good of the order, as our emergency operations manager says? Claire, any closing comments from your perspective?
No, one of the reasons I would love to have some materials between meetings or just in advance of a meeting is so that I can be better informed than I am right now. I feel like, I'm holding on here for dear life, trying to make sure I'm up to speed on it. I don't live and work in this space on a daily basis, and I really do want to be able to participate in a much more informed way. And Nuria, I hope you never stop raising your hand, because we're a small group, and your questions and comments are really thoughtful. Everybody's are, and so I guess the only thing I would say in closing is just to thank everybody for joining and for your attention and the really great conversation that we've had. A lot of potential here, even though the dollars are small, because this can lay the groundwork for other efforts that we do. So just thanks to everybody for your work.
Yes, thank you. And I think we're all learning as we go. So really appreciate that. All right, that's it, folks.
Great.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
See you next time.
Thanks, Barb.